Alright, tonight we're going to talk about this GM steering column, and this one here's got loose motion in it where the four little bolts down here on the pivot hub that bolts up to the lower portion of the column that it tilts on. Those four bolts get loose, and that's a notorious problem of all these early GM columns, or I say early. This column, they use this column design from sometime in the mid-70s into the mid-90s. This column was used in all types of GM products, Jeep products also, a lot of your Jeep Wranglers from back in the 80s, a lot of your Jeep Cherokees from back in the 80s and into the early 90s use this same column. Most of your aftermarket columns, like I Did It columns, Flaming River, most all those aftermarket tilt columns are based on this same design. Now, I've never personally took a Flaming River or I Did It column apart, so I'm not sure if they're exactly the same part by part, but they're based on this same GM column design. And this here is one of the later model of this straight style column before they switched to airbags. It's got the dimmer switch on the column, and it's also got cruise control and all that built into the turn signal. The early model columns prior to about 1981, you had the floor dimmer and the cruise control features were on the dash, so that made it a little bit simpler column design. But they're, like I said, they're all basically the same design, and really the only special tools you need to be able to service one of these columns is steering wheel removing puller with the proper bolts to fit your steering wheel, a lock plate compressor, which is this tool here, and it's relatively inexpensive. You can buy them at most any parts store or tool supplier for range anywhere from $15 to $40 from what I've seen. Now, a lot of places like Advanced Auto, AutoZone, places like that loan and rent these tools, and I'll explain how it works further along in the video. And the other one special tool you're going to need if you're tightening these lower bolts up and you're going to have to completely disassemble the column, then you have to have one of these lock claw pivot pin pullers. And this one here happens to be from Snap-on, but there's some other manufacturers out there, and I haven't looked. Advanced Auto, AutoZone, places like that may carry these tools now, but at one point this was a tool that had to come from a specialty tool supplier. This one I got from Snap-on probably about 15 years ago, and I think at the time it was somewhere around $20. This is what it looks like, and I'll show further along in the video exactly how it works. And then you're going to need a set of external Torx sockets, and I can't remember the size, I think, and I'll tell further in the video exactly what size, but I think it's this size right here, which looks like an E8, or it may be this size here. This is an E7. But the four bolts down here at the base of the column that are actually loose have an external Torx head on them. You'll need a set of those, and you'll need a set of just a basic set of Torx, internal Torx bits, and just your common hand tools, a 13mm, a 15mm, 13 and 15mm socket, basic screwdrivers. And I've already removed the nut that holds the steering wheel on, which is a 13mm, and you got this little special ring here that goes on in a groove over the end of the column that it's kind of like a safety, so if the nut was to come loose, the steering wheel can't come all the way off of the column. But we got the proper bolts selected. We're going to put our steering wheel puller in here. And there's no need to run these bolts in tight. You just want to run them down far enough that you engaged the threads to the point that you're not going to pull the threads out of the hole. Pull the bolt out of the hole and strip the threads. And it's kind of a tight fit. And you want to make sure that you run both bolts down where you get an even pull, and then run your center screw down. And you don't want to use any kind of impact wrench or anything like that. You want to do this part by hand, and then just tighten it down and it'll pull your steering wheel right off. Set it back out of the way. And this little piece right here, this is your horn button. When you get ready to take it off, this one's already off, but this little thing goes down in here and it's like a quarter turn. Like that right there, which that right there is broke. And then this is your lock plate. This is the part that the pin from the, when you turn it back and it locks the wheel, this plate has got a series of notches around it that the pin comes back in. And there's a spring behind this piece, and there's a C-clip on there that holds it. Now this tool here has got two different size threads depending on which arrow column you're working on. You want to make sure you select the right thread. And another thing on this, with this setup here, is there's a little set screw right here that comes out the side, and this is a storage place. This set screw, the purpose in it is your 70s model Cadillacs and stuff like that that had the tilt column, had the telescopic column along with the tilt column. The telescopic part was in this shaft right here, and there's was a little lever on the column that you pull one way and it would allow the column to slip in and out. Well, if you're working on one of those, you have to take this set screw out and screw it down in the end of the shaft in order to lock the wedge in that column, so you can pull on the, so you can compress the lock plate. Because if you don't, it'll just want to pull this piece on out. But I don't know, I've never only actually worked on but just a couple of those old telescopic columns. I don't know exactly what years they made them or for how many years, but I don't think they made them past about the early 80s. But a lot of you high-end Cadillacs and things like that had them. You just tighten this big wing nut down until you release enough pressure that you can get up in here to this little C-clip, and then you get something started and get it. Now we got our retaining clip loose. You just back off with a big wing nut on your compressor, and that'll relieve the spring pressure. Work it all the way out. And this is the mechanism that makes your horn operate here. That's where it picks up contact at. Take that piece off, and this is the spring that provides the pressure for the lock plate. Then you take a Phillips head screwdriver and you remove this piece here. This is a little arm that operates your turn signal cam. This part right here. Lay all these parts over to the side. Then you take a Phillips screwdriver, remove the 3 screws, that holds your turn signal cam in. And to get to the top one, you gotta put it in the right turn position. And then you got to remove, take your Phillips screwdriver and remove your hazard switch. That's just a little spring and a little screw. I want to make sure I lay it over to the side, keep up with it. Now once you do that, that'll allow that to come up. Now I've already loosened everything up under here, under the column, and disconnected the wiring harness for this turn signal cam down on the column. Alright, and once you get to that point, then you want to reach in and pull this little connector here out, and that's part of what operates the door chime buzzer and that thing for the, if you leave the keys in the ignition. And I don't think the earlier model, back in the 70s, I don't believe those columns had that part in there. And you got a little spring, like a little leaf spring in here, that goes in just like this, and that's what provides the pressure on this part right here. This part, this is set up here, and that's what makes all that stuff work exactly like it's supposed to. Alright, and at this point we're going to take the lock cylinder out. You got one little Torx pin right here. Now a lot of people have a misconception that this is the ignition switch. This is not the ignition switch. This is what they call the lock cylinder. And all this is the part that houses the mechanism for the key. And when you turn it, it operates a linkage inside this column. And the actual ignition switch is down under the dash on the bottom of the column, the actual electrical part of it. Now if you had a bad lock cylinder and was going to switch out the lock cylinder, then this is as far as you would have to go with disassembling the column. You remove this pin here, and this little pin here is a T20 Torx. And once you remove that pin in your lock cylinder, it'll slide right out, and that's the part that your ignition, that your key goes in. Alright, and then there's 3 bolts in here that holds this piece. And you've also got to remove the shaft for your tilt column. But we can slide this outer piece off without removing that shaft at this point. And these screws here are a T30. And there's 3 of them. And this little pin that sticks up right here is what engages the lock plate. And this is the back side of the lock plate with these little notches around it. They engage this pin here and it's spring loaded. And when you turn the key back to the lock position, if it's not lined up with one of the notches, it'll hold it down. But as soon as you turn the wheel enough, once it snaps into one of these notches, that's what locks your steering wheel. Then we're going to slide this part off. And you've got to get enough. At this point, this is when you need to remove this lower support down here. These 4 13mm head bolts and 2 15mm nuts. You remove the little horseshoe up under here that attaches the column to the dash so that you can get enough slack on these wires here that this whole assembly will slide off over the steering shaft. Alright, now we got our tilt lever. We're going to remove it. And this is a little plastic cover that fits in here. Lay it to the side. And here is the piece that makes sure this little piece here is what actuates on this little rod. Can you see this little rod? Actuates on this little rod here. That's your headlight dimmer. And this portion here is what allows, this is what allows it to pivot. When you put this back together, this piece fits up in here in this little groove. And you've got to make sure that you get this piece here in there in the right orientation with the lever for your turn signal. Alright. Now we're down to the point where we're going to remove the 2 pivot pins. First thing we got to do is this is the spring assembly in here that makes the wheel spring up when you pull the tilt lever. And it's just a little square hole, and it's smaller. Well, it may be 1/4 inch. No, it's smaller than 1/4 inch. But you can just take a Phillips screwdriver and just push down, turn it a 1/4 turn, and this little piece comes out. And you spring with the little ball socket on the end of it. And that's what applies spring pressure. You want to lay that on something where it can't get dirty because it's got grease on it. Then you take your little pivot pin puller, and it's made, got a little, just 2 little shoulders here is what's made to pull against. You want to thread it into your pivot pin. There's no reason to crank this down with a wrench. If you can get it all the way, just bottom it out by hand. You can just bottom it out by hand, and then you want to make sure there's a little ridge right here, and you want to turn this piece where it seats down solid and tighten your nut against it. Just like this right here. This particular one takes a 1/2 inch nut, 1/2 inch wrench. Just crank down on it right easy. You want to hold this end here. Keep it from turning, and you just crank down on it. I'm going to have to get something to hold that end with. Alright. And that's your pivot pin. There's one on the other side also. And you can just unscrew this piece from your pivot pin and lay it to the side. And when you reassemble all this, you want to use some type of heavy grease, just a light coating of heavy grease where these parts contact one another. And generally, sometimes you don't really even need to add any grease if you don't wipe the grease off of what was already there. I've found that brake caliper grease works pretty good. Works pretty good and for greasing these pins and mechanisms inside this steering column. Now we got 2 pivot pins pulled out on each side, and we're going to remove this section of the column. In order to do that, you've got to put your tilt lever back in and just slip your lock cylinder up on here so you can operate the rack that operates the ignition switch. You pull back and disengage, and then just rotate that back at the same time. And then this is your bearing retainer for the little bearing on your column. For your upper bearing, you want to slip both pieces of those out and remember which way that goes back in there. And you want to kind of, if you're not real familiar with these columns, you want to lay all this stuff out in the order that you took it apart, and take pictures and everything else to make sure you can reassemble it. And then you just pull this back and lay everything down. And then this is the rack that operates your ignition switch. And when you put this, go to put it back together, you've got to have it up in here engaged. And this is what allows it to tilt on this mechanism. And these racks break sometimes also. Alright, now we got this upper portion of the column down out of the way. And I just leave it hanging like down in here. It doesn't weigh much. I just leave the whole assembly hanging on the wiring harness. And I mean, it's not very heavy. Because if you remove all of it, you got to fish the harness up through the column. And now down in here, this is the hub that those 2 pivot pins go into, and there's 4 bolts in here, and that's where the bolts get loose. And we got to remove the upper portion of the steering shaft. And this is this little plastic coupler here is what allows the wheel to tilt. This is where it all goes on here. And all you got to do is just rotate this around and slip that out. And you want to note the orientation. There's a master spline on this upper shaft for the lock plate. You want to note the orientation of that master spline in order to get your steering wheel back on in the correct orientation with your wheels. And right in here is your 4 external Torx bolts. And they'll, you want to just, what I like to do is just take them out and put a little drop of blue Loctite on them. Just take a little bit of blue Loctite and just put a little dot of it on. And you're going to tighten these 4 bolts up, and that'll remove the play from your steering wheel. And there's a torque spec on those bolts, and I'm not real sure without going back to the book and looking, but you don't want to over tighten them, but you want to get them tight. And if anybody's interested, I could probably look up and find the torque spec. But I always just tighten them down and just feel them when I'm tightening them down, because it's not like you're putting a head on an engine or something. And a lot of people's always been concerned that once this thing gets loose and goes to moving up and down, that the steering wheel is going to fall off. And I hadn't necessarily ever believed that that's the case, but it's one of them things, if you keep running it, eventually those bolts will loosen up to the point that your turn signals will get to where they erratic about working. Your automatic transmission shifter will get erratic about working. That's just one of those things that you need to address the problem and not go too long, because if you go too long, you can damage parts of your steering column. And once you get all these 4 bolts here tight, then it's pretty much just the process of putting everything back together. And I'm not going to film the whole reassembly process, but I will show, may show some of the details of getting some of the pieces back in the proper orientation. And like I said, you want to apply a little bit of heavy grease to the bearings and the moving parts. You don't want to put so much in there that it gets everywhere, but you want to just put a light coat on it. Now like I said, I like to use, I found that brake caliper grease works pretty good because it's thick and it seems to stay on the parts. And I'm sure they make a specialized grease just for this purpose, but I hadn't never seen any and hadn't never really tried to find any. I've just always used brake caliper grease because it's what I had and it seems to do real well. But this is your dimmer switch rod, and when you go to reassemble the column, you want to make sure that it's down in the dimmer switch and clicking properly, because that's one of the biggest problems people run into when they're working on these columns, is not being able to get the headlights back where they'll dim, and getting the turn little arm back on the turn signal. But this is an easily doable job for the average person with a little bit of mechanical ability and a basic set of hand tools and these few specialized tools that we went over. And if you just lay everything out and pay attention to how it comes apart, and I don't really have my stuff laid out in any particular order, but I've took enough of these columns apart and put them back together that I know where each part's supposed to go, and if there's a part missing, then I know where it was at. But that's one of the, and I've went behind a lot of people that have tried to service these columns themselves, and that's a common problem, is them winding up with a bunch of leftover parts, like these little pieces right here. They'll get down there to the end and won't be able to figure out how them pieces fit back in there, and they just leave them out, and then you wind up with features of your column not working properly. We got this portion of the column back on. We got 2 pins, pivot pins started, and in order to get those pins started, you got to just release this lever here enough that you can get them lined up, and then once you get them lined up, you can let it go. You want to use just a flat-ended pin punch, just a little small hammer, and just tap them back down in there till you hear them bottom out. And you want to make sure to use something that's flat and about as large a diameter as the pin, so you don't damage the threads for the pulling holes. So if you ever have to disassemble the column again, you won't be able to get your tool started in there. And there is virtually no way that I know of to get those pins out without that tool. So if you mess around and break the tool off in it or damage the threads, then you're just, I have had one incident where I had to take the column out and drill the pin out, and the problem with that pin is it's a hardened pin and you can't drill it with just a standard drill bit. Alright, we've got our column successfully reassembled, everything except putting the steering wheel back on and reattaching it under here to the dash support, and hooking up the wiring harnesses for the column. And some of the tips you want to do is, as you assemble it, you want to, each stage you want to check and make sure everything's working properly, like your headlight dimmer, your turn signals. You want to cycle your ignition switch, make sure everything's feels good, and that's pretty much all it is to this column. And like I said, other than having 3 specialized tools and basic hand tools and a set of internal and external Torx drivers, then that's really all the special equipment that's required to service these tilt GM style columns. If anybody has any questions, just send a message or just respond to the video, and I'll try to answer questions as they come in.